In the quiet confines of his quarters aboard the battleship Nagato in the spring of 1940, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto wrestled with a burden that few others in Imperial Japan could fully comprehend. He was the architect of a strategy he knew was doomed to ultimate failure. The concept of a preemptive strike against the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor was his creation. Born not of military aggression but of desperation, Yamamoto realized with chilling clarity that if Japan were forced into a conflict with America, its only conceivable hope lay in delivering a knockout blow in the opening hours. Yet, the man designing the most audacious surprise attack in naval history was also the man who recognized, perhaps better than anyone else in his nation, why such an attack would eventually lead to Japan's ruin. Yamamoto's insight was not merely theoretical, it was born of experience. Unlike many of his contemporaries in the Japanese military hierarchy who viewed the United States through the distorting lens of distance and cultural prejudice, Yamamoto had lived among the Americans. His time at Harvard University between 1919 and 1921 had been officially dedicated to English studies, but his real curriculum was the study of American power. He had absorbed the culture not from books, but from the inside out, even hitchhiking across the vast continent during summer breaks to stand amid the sprawling oil fields of Texas and witness the visceral reality of industrial might. At Harvard, he was remembered as an intensely curious and imaginative student, but it was at the poker table that he learned his most valuable lessons about the American character. He became obsessed with the game, studying the mathematics of probability and the psychology of the bluff, mastering the art of reading an opponent's tells. Those long nights of cards taught him something profound that the insular military leaders back in Tokyo never grasped. Americans were not reckless cowboys. They were calculating strategists. They played the long game, willing to absorb short-term losses if it meant positioning themselves for a final, decisive win. And once they held the winning hand, Yamamoto observed, they pressed their advantage without a shred of mercy. His subsequent tours as a naval attaché in Washington during the late 1920s only deepened this understanding. He toured the automobile factories of Detroit, watching in awe as assembly lines churned out vehicles at rates that defied Japanese comprehension. He walked through the steel mills of Pittsburgh and returned to the Texas refineries, calculating tonnages and production capacities that terrified him. He later famously remarked that anyone who had seen Detroit's auto factories and Texas's oil fields knew that Japan lacked the national power for a naval race with America. Yet, back in Tokyo, a dangerous delusion was taking root, a catastrophic misreading of their future adversary that Yamamoto tried in vain to correct. The roots of Japan's fatal misjudgment ran deep, fueled by a potent mixture of historical misinterpretation, racial stereotyping, and wishful thinking. Japanese military planners were haunted by the specter of their own success in the Russo-Japanese War decades earlier. In 1904, they had launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, a tactic that parallels Pearl Harbor in striking ways. An undeclared assault destroying naval power at anchor before mobilization was possible. The subsequent victories on land at Port Arthur and Muk, culminating in Admiral Togo's legendary annihilation of the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima in 1900, had cemented a specific strategic doctrine in the Japanese mind. They believed that a ferocious surprise offensive against a larger power could yield rapid military successes, forcing the enemy to negotiate a settlement rather than endure a prolonged conflict. This was the template they intended to apply to the United States. But the lesson was fundamentally flawed. Russia in 1905 was a crumbling autocracy, racked by internal revolution and fighting thousands of miles from its industrial base. Japan's victory had been as much about Russian weakness as Japanese strength. Yet the Japanese military remembered only the triumph, convincing themselves that the Tsushima model would work against America, failing to realize they were facing an entirely different kind of adversary. This strategic error was compounded by a profound cultural contempt for the Western democracies that pervaded Japanese leadership throughout the 1930s. They observed the inaction of Western powers as Italy invaded Ethiopia, as Germany remilitarized the Rhineland and absorbed Austria, and as Japan itself brutally expanded into Manchuria and China. The West protested and imposed feeble sanctions, but they did not fight. To the militarists in Tokyo, this was evidence that democracies lacked the stomach for war. They deluded themselves into believing that societies valuing individual rights and personal comfort could never match the sacrificial spirit of Japan, where duty to the emperor transcended life itself. This contempt was reinforced by deep-seated racial thinking. Many Japanese officers viewed Americans as fundamentally inferior warriors, too attached to luxury and materialism to endure the rigors of sustained combat. They pointed to America's isolationist politics and divided public opinion as proof of national weakness, concluding in official assessments that the American culture was shallow and its people lacked the spiritual stamina for a long war. It was a staggering misreading of the American character, one Yamamoto tried to dispel by warning that the presumed American love of luxury was a facade and that they would respond to an attack with terrifying determination. His warnings fell on deaf ears. The final element of this deadly calculation was the assumption that even if America did fight back, its immense industrial potential would take years to mobilize. Japanese planners believed this window of time would allow them to consolidate their conquests across Asia, establish an impenetrable defensive perimeter in the Pacific, and eventually force a war-weary America to accept a negotiated peace rather than fight a grinding war to retake distant islands. This, too, was a fantasy. Although Imperial Navy studies in 1941 accurately predicted the trends in American shipbuilding that would eventually overwhelm them, the leadership refused to believe a democratic society could harness its own potential. They gambled that labor disputes, political infighting, and the public's demand for consumer goods would paralyze American mobilization. They were betting their empire on the belief that Americans would choose comfort over victory. But reality began to close in on Japan in the summer of 1941. Following Japan's occupation of French Indochina, President Franklin Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States, effectively severing commercial relations. Britain and the Dutch East Indies quickly followed suit. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Japan lost access to 3/4 of its overseas trade and, most critically, 88% of its imported oil, most of which came from America. The clock began ticking. Without new sources, the Japanese Navy's oil reserves would run dry in perhaps 18 months under wartime conditions. Faced with the choice of economic strangulation and a humiliating withdrawal from China, or a desperate war to seize the resources of Southeast Asia, Japan chose war. The militarists presented this not as a choice, but as an inescapable necessity for national survival. Yet they refused to present an honest assessment of what victory would require. Yamamoto alone dared to speak the truth. In a letter intended to warn against the conflict, he wrote that capturing Guam, the Philippines, or even Hawaii would not be enough. True victory would require marching into Washington and dictating peace terms in the White House, a feat he knew was impossible. He was stating a strategic reality. America, protected by 2 oceans and possessing unlimited resources, could not be knocked out by naval defeats in distant waters. Any war lasting more than a year or two would inevitably end in Japanese defeat due to sheer industrial disparity. Knowing this, Yamamoto did his duty and designed the Pearl Harbor operation not to win the war, but to team a desperate gamble that a shattered American fleet would lead to a negotiated settlement before the sleeping giant could fully awaken. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the gamble began. The first wave of Japanese aircraft, led by Commander Mitsuo, achieved complete surprise over Oahu. For the next 2 hours, hell rained down on the American Pacific Fleet. Battleship Row became a cauldron of fire and sinking steel. The USS Arizona was obliterated by a catastrophic magazine explosion, taking nearly 1,200 men down with her. The Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds. By the time the Japanese withdrew, over 2,400 Americans were dead. The battle fleet was decimated, and American air power on the island was destroyed on the ground. Tactically, it was a stunning success, achieved with minimal Japanese losses. Yet, in the smoke of that Sunday morning, the seeds of Japan's ultimate defeat were already sown. The primary targets, the American aircraft carriers, were providentially out to sea. Furthermore, the Japanese failed to destroy the vital fuel oil storage tanks, which held enough fuel to keep the fleet operating for months, and left the repair facilities largely intact. Admiral Nagumo, fearing a counterattack against his precious carriers, chose not to launch a third strike to finish the job. He left behind a devastated harbor, but also an intact industrial base, and the very ships that would soon lead the American counteroffensive. Far more devastating than the tactical errors, however, was the strategic miscalculation regarding American psychology. The attack was intended to shatter American morale and prove that a war in the Pacific was too costly to pursue. It achieved the precise opposite. Overnight, the deep divisions between interventionists and isolationists evaporated. The America First Committee dissolved, and a nation that had been reluctant to send its sons to foreign wars was instantly unified in a cold fury. President Roosevelt's call for a declaration of war was met with near unanimous support in Congress. The Japanese had expected American resolve to crumble. Instead, they created a terrible, unified resolve that would not be sated until total victory. The Japanese had awakened exactly what Yamamoto feared most. The first cracks in the facade of Japanese invincibility appeared just 4 months later, in April 1942. With the Doolittle raid, though the physical damage to Tokyo from the 16 B-5 bombers was minimal, the psychological impact was such. The raid shattered the Japanese military's assurances that the home islands and the sacred emperor were invulnerable. It proved that America was willing to take immense risks to strike back. Yamamoto understood the true meaning of the raid better than his superiors. The Americans were coming, and they would not stop until they reached Tokyo itself. This humiliation accelerated Yamamoto's plans for the Midway operation, a complex scheme intended to draw out and destroy the remaining American carriers, thereby completing the work begun at Pearl Harbor and securing Japan's defensive perimeter. It was to be the largest naval force Japan had ever assembled, including 4 of the fleet carriers that had attacked Hawaii. On paper, the American force of 3 carriers, one of them, the Yorktown, hastily patched together after being damaged at the Coral Siwas, vastly outnumbered. But the Americans possessed a weapon Yamamoto did not anticipate. The codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii, who had deciphered enough of the Japanese naval code to learn the target and timing of the attack, forewarned. Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his carriers to ambush the Japanese fleet. On June 4, 1942, almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's prophetic warning that he could only guarantee success for half a year came to pass. In a matter of 5 minutes, American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers with their decks full of refueling and rearming aircraft. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were turned into blazing wrecks in moments. The Hiryu was destroyed later that day. The catastrophe at Midway was absolute. Japan lost 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, over 300 aircraft, and, most devastatingly, hundreds of its most experienced pilots and aircrewsmen, whose skill had taken years to hone, and who could not be replaced by a training system geared for a short war. The strategic initiative in the Pacific was instantly and permanently wrested from Japan. From that day forward, the Imperial Navy would be fighting a defensive war, attempting to hold what it had conquered against an adversary whose power was only just beginning to manifest. The subsequent campaign on Guadalcanal, beginning in August 1942, became the crucible where the myth of Japanese ground superiority was shattered. For 6 grueling months, U.S. Marines and Army soldiers fought a savage battle of attrition in the pestilential jungles of the Solomon Islands. It was a campaign fought on land, at sea in the treacherous waters of Iron Bottom Sound, and in the air above Henderson Field. The Japanese leadership, unable to accept the loss of the strategic island, threw wave after wave of soldiers and ships into the fight. American troops, whom Japanese propaganda had dismissed as soft and lacking warrior spirit, endured appalling conditions: malaria, heat, supply shortages, and constant bombardment, and fought with a tenacity that stunned their enemy. They faced Japanese soldiers who lived by a code that viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace, leading to battles of terrifying ferocity. By the time Japanese forces finally withdrew in February 1943, they had suffered staggering losses in men, ships, and aircraft that they could not replace. Guadalcanal proved that on a level playing field, American ground forces were more than a match for Japan's best. While these battles raged in the far Pacific, the great American industrial machine, which Japanese planners had discounted, was performing miracles of production that defied all historical precedent. The conversion of the American economy to war production was swift and total. Automobile factories that had once competed for civilian consumers were transformed almost overnight into arsenals of democracy. The Ford Motor Company's massive Willow Run plant, utilizing assembly line principles never before applied to aviation, eventually churned out B-24 bombers at a rate of 1 every 63 minutes. The statistics of this industrial mobilization were Henry Kaiser's shipyards revolutionized shipbuilding, slashing the construction time for a Liberty ship from months to mere days. Women entered the workforce in droves, becoming the iconic Rosie the Riveters who welded holes in riveted aircraft skins, constituting over a third of the defense manufacturing workforce by 1944. By 1943, American shipyards were launching more tonnage in a single year than Japan produced during the entire war. By 1944, the United States was responsible for more than half of all industrial production globally. The disparity was most glaring in the tools of naval warfare. In the 3 years after Midway, Japan managed to build 6 aircraft carriers, while the United States launched 17, creating vast carrier task forces, supported by endless trains of supply ships that allowed them to operate thousands of miles from base for months on end. The Japanese leadership had gambled that democracy was a hindrance to mobilization, that a free people would not accept the necessary sacrifices of rationing and hard labor. They were catastrophically wrong. The American public accepted shortages of everything from gasoline to meat, bought billions in war bonds, and worked grueling hours without complaint, matching the sacrifices of any totalitarian state. As American industrial power surged in its forces, began their inexorable march across the Pacific. Japanese pilots and commanders began to encounter a disturbing reality. The Americans were fighting differently, not just with superior numbers of ships and planes, but with a skill, aggression, and determination that contradicted every tenet of Japanese military doctrine. The Japanese had emphasized spiritual strength as the decisive factor in war, believing American soldiers raised in comfort would lack the will to close with the enemy. Instead, they faced Marines who stormed fortified beaches into the teeth of machine gun fire, pilots who pressed attacks through walls of flak, and sailors who fought blazing ships until the water overtook them. The fundamental Japanese error had been to confuse America's pre-war reluctance to fight with an inability to fight. Once the debate over intervention was settled by Japanese bombs, the democratic deliberation turned into a ferocious unity of purpose. Japanese commanders discovered that American forces would not negotiate local truces, would not accept compromise, and would not stop until total victory was achieved. In April 1943, the architect of the war, Admiral Yamamoto, was killed when American P-38 fighters, acting on decrypted intelligence, ambushed his transport plane over Bougainville. His death was a severe blow to Japanese morale, removing the one leader who commanded genuine loyalty and who had consistently warned against underestimating the enemy. But by the time of his death, Yamamoto's darkest predictions had already come true. The industrial tide he had foreseen was drowning Japan's military. The remaining 2 years of the war were a brutal progression of American island-hopping campaigns, each bringing U.S. forces closer to the Japanese homeland. The strategy was deliberate and ruthless: bypass heavily defended non-strategic islands, leaving their garrisons to wither on the vine, while seizing key positions to serve as air bases for the next advance. The fighting grew progressively more savage as the Americans approached Japan. The Battle for Tarawa in late 1943 was a shocking wake-up call regarding the intensity of Japanese resistance, costing over 1,000 Marine lives in just 76 hours to dig out a garrison that fought almost to the last man. The campaigns in the Marianas in the summer of 1944, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were decisive, placing American B-29 bombers within range of Japanese cities. The capture of Saipan was marked by horrific scenes of masses of Japanese civilians committing suicide, driven by propaganda that convinced them Americans were monsters. At Iwo Jima in early 1945, Marines fought for over a month to capture 8 square miles of volcanic rock, heavily fortified with tunnels and bunkers. Nearly 7,000 Americans died to dig out a garrison of 21,000, only a few hundred of whom surrendered. The subsequent battle for Okinawa lasted almost 3 months and cost over 12,000 American lives, featuring mass attacks by kamikaze suicide aircraft and terrible civilian suffering. Japanese strategy in these final stages was predicated on making victory so hideously expensive in American blood that the U.S. public would demand a negotiated peace rather than continue the slaughter. It was yet another misreading of their enemy. Instead of breaking American will, the mounting casualties only hardened the resolve to finish the job completely, to justify the sacrifices with total victory. By the summer of 1945, Japan was prostrate, its navy was annihilated, its air force reduced to suicide attacks, and its cities were being systematically reduced to ashes by American firebombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Yet, even as their nation burned and starved, the militarist government refused to surrender, still clinging to the delusion of a final, decisive battle on the home islands that would force a stalemate. It took the unprecedented destruction of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 to finally break the will of the Japanese leadership. The war that had begun with a surprise attack designed to force a quick negotiation ended only with Japan's unconditional surrender. The final act took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. The symbolism was deliberate and crushing. The surrender was signed on the deck of a ship named for an American state, under the shadow of massive guns representing the industrial power that had overwhelmed Japan. In the harbor of a capital city that lay in ruins, among the flags present was one that had flown over the U.S. Capitol on the day of Pearl Harbor, and another that had been carried by Commodore Matthew Perry when he forcibly opened Japan to the West nearly a century earlier. The message was unmistakable. Japan's imperial ambitions had ended exactly where they began, encircled by American power. The great miscalculation born of racial stereotypes, cultural arrogance, and strategic wishful thinking had cost Japan everything. The nation lost over 2 million military personnel and nearly 1 million civilians. 66 of its cities were destroyed, its empire vanished, and its once proud navy was at the bottom of the ocean. The United States had also paid a terrible price, with over 400,000 dead, but America emerged from the conflict as the undisputed global superpower, its industrial capacity dwarfing that of the rest of the world combined. The nation that Japanese leaders had dismissively characterized as soft, decadent, and incapable of sustained sacrifice had proven itself capable of waging and winning the greatest and most terrible war in human history. Admiral Yamamoto's warnings, based on his genuine understanding of the American people, had been tragically ignored by men who preferred their own comforting delusions to hard reality. The consequences of that self-deception were measured in the ruins of an empire and millions of lost lives. A stark historical testament to the catastrophic danger of underestimating an adversary based on prejudice rather than fact.